Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, salam. Welcome everyone to MACFEST 2026, to another fascinating event, part of the International Festival, one of the 9 mini festivals MACFEST is hosting every year. Today we're looking at Islamic Empires with Justin Marozzi. Earlier this year we looked at the Muslim heritage in Italy and Muslim cathedrals, and last year we looked at Islamic Gardens of Paradise. All these events have been recorded. Today's event is also being recorded. You can watch them on MACFEST YouTube channel. And to find the link to MACFEST YouTube channel, you just need to go to MACFEST website, homepage, scroll down, there's the icon to click on. Now, before we start today, I just wanted to give a little announcement. We have extended the deadline of MACFEST Arts Award submission process to 25th of June. So if there are still any Muslim artists based in the UK who were late with their submission, you still have time. Please do submit. We do want to see your artworks. The submission process is free. You've got nothing to lose. So, who's the best person to host today's event? Then Mustafa from the Islamic travel agency. He's traveled to over 80 countries. And the Islamic Travels is the organization that has been partnering with MACFEST to create the amazing MACFEST Muslim Heritage Tours. If you haven't seen them, you can read more on MACFEST website. So Mustafa holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and a master's in petroleum engineering from Imperial College London. And he has a strong interest in languages, geopolitics, and Islamic history, and has been, as I said, fortunate enough to travel to over 80 countries. He's the co-founder of Islamic Travels, and this company was established more than 13 years ago with the aim of providing holistic travel experiences guided by Islamic principles. In recent years, they have organized trips to destinations as diverse as Albania, Uzbekistan, Indonesia, Peru, and Tanzania. Welcome, Mustafa. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction, Katarzyna. Basically, I'd like to welcome all of you to this special seminar entitled Exploring the Legacy of Islamic Empires. And it gives me a real pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker today. It's Justin Marozzi, who's an award-winning historian and journalist who spent the majority of his professional life and career writing about the Muslim world. He's covered places ranging from Iraq to Libya to Afghanistan and Somalia, and he's been the author of 9 books. One of them is quite an interesting one, or very interesting one, that I've just had a flick through. It's called Baghdad, City of Peace and City of Blood. And he was awarded the Royal Society of Literature's 2015 Ondaatje Prize. His most recent book, Captives and Companions, A History of Slavery and the Slave Trade in the Islamic World, was shortlisted for the 2025 Baillie Gifford Prize. Justin is very accomplished, is a fellow and former trustee of the Royal Geographical Society, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and a senior advisor to the Middle East Association. So really looking forward to this discussion. It covers a whole sort of, I guess it covers the majority of Islamic history, starting from Mecca in the 7th century to Doha and the Middle East in the 21st century. So although it seems linear by the look of it, it's certainly history is by no means linear. We're going to be dovetailing in and out of different periods, and Justin will take us on that journey. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our special guest, Justin Marozzi.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, for that generous introduction, and thank you to MACFEST for hosting us today. And for those who've joined, I've already seen a couple of salams from Egypt, Indonesia, and the UK. Egypt is one of the, or Cairo rather, one of the many places that we'll be discussing in the next hour and a half or so. Just to give a bit of introduction about the book, it was really it came out in 2019, And at the time, I suppose, like there is a lot in the Western media, the Middle East and Islamic world, the coverage was very doom and gloom filled. I suppose you could argue that not much has changed in the intervening years. But when I started the book, I didn't want to write about terrorism. I didn't want to write about Arab Spring revolutions and all the contemporary challenges, unless there were really good historical reasons to do that, linking the past with the present. And what I was really trying to do was to tell the 15 centuries of Islamic history through 15 cities, and trying to find ones that were particularly important, valuable, in mostly their most glorious periods. So 7th century Mecca, start of the story. You can't talk about Islamic history without looking at Mecca in the 7th century for obvious reasons, and then just tracing it through century by century, city by city, to end in Doha in the 21st century. So I think for just, like an overview before we get going city by city, looking back on the project, I think for much of those 15 centuries, in my mind, the Islamic world was very much in the driving seat through a succession of Islamic empires, really lording it over the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and swathes of the Indian subcontinent, parts of Europe too. And it interested me that it's both ascendant on the battlefield and triumphant in the battle of ideas as well. So it's really that leading civilizational force. And I think that's reflected in the histories of these cities as well. Like I say, at their most interesting moments for me anyway. So it's a bit of a gallop because we're covering best part of 1500 years, and Mustafa and I are planning to just interact throughout the presentation with any questions or queries, whatever it may be. So shall I just go on to the first couple of slides, please?
Yes, please. Yep. Go for it.
And let's go straight into Mecca. But the other thing I should also do, just to say, some people have said to me, this is almost like a sort of travel book itself, or it's a mouth-watering list of places to visit, which might strike a chord with you, Mustafa, with your travel hat on. So, the story begins in Mecca, in a mountain cave high above the desert settlement. A very challenging environment, not hospitable. The early Islamic poets were fairly united in saying it was a really tough environment. Here's a poet called Al-Haikatan. He said that Mecca was a place where winter and summer are equally intolerable. No waters flow, not a blade of grass on which to rest the eye. And a line from Abraham speaking to God in the Quran, he described it simply as a valley without cultivation. So maybe we could suggest that a harsh desert is a fertile place for prophetic intervention. And in the year 610, as I'm sure everyone in this session already knows, high up in the cave, the 40-year-old Muhammad had his first revelation. And God spoke to him then and continued to speak to him for a number of years. I remember the late Queen Elizabeth, there was that famous line about her saying that she went up a tree, a princess, and came down a queen. I think in Mecca, something far more extraordinary than that happens. It's really, you could say, one of the most spectacular promotions in history. The Prophet, Muhammad went up the mountain as a simple merchant and came down from that mountain as the Prophet of God. And Islam is born, and it's born in this city. It's a very challenging time for Muhammad with the opposition of pagan Meccans, well described in the early Islamic histories. But really, obviously, Mecca became the lodestar of Islam and remains so to this day. Next slide, please.
Are you able to mention who put that drawing together? It's quite an unusual one. I've never seen it before. I'm just wondering.
I'm not sure. Yeah, thanks, Mustafa. I'm not sure if it could. I think it might be Dutch. I'm going to guess that I think it's possibly 18th century.
Right. Yeah, because
and obviously very stylized as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Here we have obviously the Kaaba, and looming above it the Abraj al-Bayt clock tower. For me, it was quite interesting looking at some of the commentaries within the Islamic world about the more recent architectural development of Mecca. And I think the Ottomans in particular were quite sensitive to a number of sites that dated back to Ottoman times that were demolished to make way for a much more, well, you can see the dense urban settlement. I thought what interested me about Mecca is the only city in my list of 15 today where when non-Muslims obviously are prohibited from visiting. There's also a tradition, interestingly to me again, of sort of monetizing pilgrimage. So where people may sort of make some remarks about the Mecca having become quite a commercialized city, and I remember one Muslim writer I described it in the book. He said I think the last image he saw before turning towards the Kaaba was a Samsonite, sorry, not Samsonite, Haagen-Dazs ice cream shop or something. But even in that, with the historians hat on, I'd say that there is a long continuity on pilgrims being seen as a source of income. It's very important in a town which 1,500 years ago struggled economically. And there's a line from a very early writer who says that the pilgrims are like our crops. They're there to be sort of harvested. Interestingly, again, we're historically minded here. That this complex that we're looking at now stands on 95% of Mecca's millennium-old buildings. So you have, for example, the house of Abu Bakr, Muhammad's closest companion and the first caliph, now is the Mecca Hilton. The Prophet's house was buried beneath a new royal palace, and the house of Khadija, the Prophet's beloved first wife, gave way to a block of public lavatories. So there are obviously sensitivities about the way Mecca has been developed, but equally, I think the Saudis would say we need to cope with the far greater numbers of pilgrims that are visiting year after year after year, and they have to be accommodated. Should we move on to Damascus, please? I often try to say, begin each city with a line along the line of, one of my favorite cities. And the truth is that many of these 15 are some of my absolute favorite cities on earth. And Damascus would certainly be right up there as one of those. This is within the Umayyad Mosque. And it's, I suppose, one of the great monuments of Umayyad Damascus. So the Islamic Empire surging out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century in this great display of military muscle and spiritual heft. After 661, with the Caliph Ali's assassination, the capital of the Islamic world moved to Damascus, and you see this, I guess the kind of architectural imprint of a new imperial headquarters taking root, and there's nothing more magnificent or monumental than the Umayyad Mosque, which really dominates central Damascus. Obviously, this is also a really important time for the Arab conquests, which extended deep into Europe, right across North Africa, into the Iberian Peninsula, and it only really ended in the West at 733 with the Battle of Tours. The Umayyad Mosque, 4th holiest site for Muslims after those in Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, really the crowning symbol of early Islamic Damascus, said to contain the buried head of John the Baptist. And when approaching these cities with the historian's hat on, like so many of these places, it's this great palimpsest. Islam was written over Christianity. Christianity had been written over the monuments of pagan Rome, and they themselves had replaced those of the ancient Assyrians. But in this case here in Damascus, Islam has proved most enduring. Contrast with the next slide, please. And this was where Mustafa and I were talking about the balance between contemporary writing and historical. And I thought, because of what had happened in Damascus, really from 2011 onwards, the Arab Spring and the revolution against President Bashar al-Assad, that here we had to think about contemporary Syria. And throughout the book, in various places, I did provide some contemporary reportage from this part of the world. This is a view of the suburb of Arbin in Damascus, sorry. Historically, for many Arab writers over the centuries, Damascus was simply seen as a paradise on earth. At the time I wrote this book, and for years afterwards, the UN called it hell on earth. And swathes of the city were just turned into this terrible urban apocalypse. and Syria itself obviously transformed over that past decade into a nation of refugees, of the dead and the dying. Since I wrote the book, obviously, the Assad regime has fallen and there is a new period, and everyone is hopeful that Syria has turned a corner. Obviously, great challenges still remain there as well. So I know these are obviously fairly summary overviews because we're dealing with 15 cities in a limited time. Can we move, please, to Baghdad?
Just before we move on there, I was just going to say that Damascus, or Syria, was one of the first countries that my parents allowed me to go to on my own. So my travels sort of started from there. And this is sort of pre-Bashar al-Assad. So when Hafiz al-Assad was alive, it was at that time, it's sort of the late 90s. And yeah, it was an interesting time. It was Damascus, or Syria in general, was one of those places which wasn't extremely poor, but it wasn't rich either. It was somewhere plodding along in the middle. And people were just sort of quietly getting on with it. I guess, you know, having a big brother and a sort of a state apparatus kind of looking over you, people just generally didn't want to rock the boat. But generally, you know, that things were working in some form or another. It was an unusual place, but I felt very blessed there. And I did go to the Umayyad Mosque and saw the tomb of Yahya or John the Baptist, as you mentioned earlier on. And there's also sort of eschatological sort of implications in regards to the mosque with the second coming of Jesus, according to Islam. There's a Western minaret, if I'm correct, where he's believed to descend in the future. So I think there's quite a lot of significance to this place and to the Umayyad Mosque in general.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with you, Mustafa. The sort of pleasures of travel in Syria, and I particularly remember the extraordinary hospitality. Obviously, that could apply to a number of places, regions, peoples here, but yeah, I've got really fond memories of Syria, and sadly haven't been in a number of years.
Yeah, and the Arabic accent, sorry to dwell on Syria, but I have real fond memories as well. But the accent was also quite an interesting one because it has a bit of a sing-song tone to it. So we went to study standard Arabic, and we found that the Syrian dialect had this very sort of interesting intonation, which was different from a lot of the other parts of the Arab world. And I'm sure the native Arab speakers will be able to sort of attest to it, how it's seen as it's quite unique, the Syrian accent.
Yes, and I think as well, correct me if I'm wrong, different again from the next city we were on Baghdad, with quite an unusual dialect.
Yeah.
I think it's the only place I've heard shaku maku and various other colloquial Arabic, Iraqi style.
Absolutely.
So Baghdad, we're in the 9th century, so we've done Mecca, Damascus. I was saying to Mustafa and Kaysra a moment ago that you could probably draw up a list of 15 entirely different cities, but I think some of these earliest ones, like Mecca, Damascus, Baghdad, I think really need to be in any list of those early Islamic cities, because they're the center of it all. You know, Mecca, the birth of Islam; Damascus, the headquarters of the Umayyad dynasty; and then we moved to Baghdad, which is for 500 years was the center for the Abbasid Empire. An extraordinary period, really, when I think Baghdad, in its own eyes, certainly, and for many others, Muslims or non-Muslims alike, perhaps the greatest city on earth, a pulsating center of science and scholarship, bloodshed and conquest, pilgrimage, procreation, and palatial building. One of my favorite characters from this period, there are so many actually, but the medieval Arab writer Al-Jahiz, the goggle-eyed, widely considered to be one of the greatest writers of Arabic prose. And he appealed to me because of just the almost dizzying range of his writing, utterly fearless, and really kind of capturing the intellectual spirit of the time. He just roved so widely. He wrote about, for example, the superiority of black men over whites, pigeon racing, Islamic theology, miserliness, and the next one is a very odd one, the Aristotelian view of fish, and possibly most controversially, excuse this remark, but it comes from 9th century Jahiz, whether women should be permitted to make noises of pleasure while having sex. So 9th century Baghdad was, I think, like all the world's greatest cities, one of the most cosmopolitan. And I think that theme, I was totally unaware of it before starting this book and the research, and then city by city, as the project wore on over a number of years, I kind of started to be feeling aware that these cities are at their best, they're at their greatest, most powerful, most confident, when they are most cosmopolitan and tolerant generally. Muslims, Christians, Jews living together more or less happily. And this is, these pictures just demonstrating some of the great Islamic science of this early time, an astrolabe on the left from 10th century Baghdad, and a portrait of the eye, early ophthalmology at a similar time. So really, absolutely the center of scientific progress. There was another Baghdad slide, if I may, coming next, which again is interesting. I mean, I suppose the Christian world, this is a crude parallel, would be the kind of tussles and tensions between Catholics and Protestants. And Iraq, interestingly, where you have the Sunni and Shia Muslims, with those strands emerging in the early days of Islam. I mean, pre-Baghdad, obviously, not least with the Caliph Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law. So you have in this city, and it's expressed monumentally and architecturally. Here we have the Abu Hanifa Mosque, I think that's to the left, and the Kademia Mosque in Baghdad was home, respectively, to the Sunni and Shia Muslims of Iraq. Should we move on, Mustafa, from Baghdad?
Oh yes, yeah, no, definitely. One thing, as you say, there is that kind of you don't have to go very far to move from a place that is revered by Shia Muslims to something that's revered by Sunnis, and then there's places that are revered by both, and that's the beauty of Iraq. There's a lot of that kind of juxtaposition within short spaces.
Short spaces, exactly. Those two mosques are not that far away from each other. They're both, I think there's
either a river or a bridge between the two. Yeah, there's literally, like, we're talking about hundreds of meters maybe between the two.
And they're both, you know, completely magnificent and drawing really great crowd. In fact, on the right you can see the Tigris River to the top right there. Yeah. That great river of Mesopotamia, Iraq. So from there, we're going to travel 3,000 miles to the west. Cordoba in English/Spanish, Al Cordoba in Arabic. Virtually Islam's westernmost point. So we've gone now from 9th century Baghdad to 10th century Islamic Cordoba. And again, like Baghdad, but this time a couple of 3,000 miles to the west, one of the greatest cities of its time, probably the finest and largest city in Europe under Islamic rule. In the words of a German nun, it was decus orbis, Latin, the ornament of the world. It had a population then in the 10th century of 100,000, which is extraordinary, really. That put it on a par with Constantinople, huge. And at roughly the same time, you had London and Paris with 20,000. So 5 times as big as those two capitals. And again, like Baghdad, a great center of science and scholarship, art and music, and of course, trade. And then from 929, home also to a new self-declared caliphate. So you have this period, although the Abbasids start as masters of the entire Islamic world in 750 with the overthrow of the Umayyads, over those 500 years, you have a fracturing of sort of like a single Islamic polity, and new dynasties, new regimes pop up in different parts of the Islamic world. So 929, you had this really a continuation of the Umayyad rule from the only surviving dynast who managed to escape his would-be assassins all across North Africa, got to the Iberian Peninsula and started an emirate, which then became a caliphate a couple of hundred years later. And interestingly, I referred to tolerance a moment ago. It became the scene of what Spanish would refer to as convivencia, the more or less peaceful coexistence between the 3 Abrahamic faith groups, Muslims, Christians, Jews. Although that's still the subject of fairly vigorous academic debate to this day. Cordoba also boasted the most magnificent mosque in the Western Islamic world, which we can see in the next slide, please. And if the architectural style here was consciously seeking to sort of recreate the palm trees of Syria, which the Umayyads had left behind them 3,000 miles to the east, and this sort of longing for that desert environment reflected in this absolutely beautiful, sublime architectural style. This became a church after the Reconquista in 1236, and then in 1523 a cathedral. Today, depending on who you are, it's either the Mezquita Cathedral or the Catedral de Nuestra Señora de la Asunción. And it's a sensitive subject under Spanish rule today. Muslims are not allowed to pray inside it. People try to do that from time to time, and then quickly are told to move on or something by security for the monument. Staying on Cordoba for the last slide, you have to do a bit more imaginative work here to picture that sort of magnificent scene here. Really, these are the ruins of this 10th century palace called Medinat al-Zahra, the shining city, which took 40 years to build. And amazingly, with a sort of economics figure, it consumed a third of the Umayyad state revenues. Just amazing. You imagine we complained about HS2 in the UK about being a far too expensive project. This took a third of all state revenues. Quite amazing. But again, also it remained a reminder of the wealth, power, and sophistication of the medieval Islamic world. So that is the end of the 10th century.
Whilst we're moving slides, I want to mention something from one of our attendees, and Morag was saying that it's striking that this is the opposite of what happened to the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, where the Hagia Sophia changed from a church to a mosque, and then here it's a mosque which changed into a cathedral. So there was that kind of
very interesting dynamic, and sort of in both, probably in both places, controversial. So controversial that Muslims are not allowed to pray in that monument in Cordoba, and then controversial to some, especially the Greeks, the Hagia Sophia, which had been, I think it was a museum for about 100 years from Ataturk, and more recently under Erdogan, is a mosque again. Well, talking of controversy, the next one, I would call it the most contested city really on earth. I think that might be arguable. Do you think, Mustafa, the most contested city on earth?
No, I think a lot of people would agree with that, in many different ways, but yeah, certainly.
In many different ways, yeah. It's home to the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism, home to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which stands on the site of Christ's crucifixion, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina, and then home to this great monument here on the right-hand side, the Dome of the Rock. The most ancient surviving Muslim monument in the world, actually, built in 692 by the Caliph Abd al-Malik. And you could see at the time, it's harder to see in this photo, but it just stood out over all other buildings in the city. Built on the site where Abraham had been prepared to sacrifice his son. So we talk about, I mentioned the word contest. What could be more, contested, controversial, bloody than the Crusades? So the next picture is sort of, I think, captures the spirit of 1099, when a Crusader army reached Jerusalem, put it under siege and entered the sword and cut down swathes of Muslims in cold blood. And this man with his arms aloft there is Godfrey of Bouillon from the First Crusade. And at a time when you have these Crusader accounts boasting of knights hacking down men and women in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and one historian actually described it riding in blood up to their bridles. And I think if you remember when the war in Iraq happened, President George Bush used the word crusade, and I think he just did it with no sort of sense of the meaning of it, what it meant in the Muslim world, that word crusade. But this is from that particular period. I thought, for me, 1099 needed to be, or the Crusades had to be part of the story here. And I thought Jerusalem, I suppose you could pick many different centuries to talk about Islamic Jerusalem, but I thought 1099, the 11th century, would be interesting. And I have a sort of chronology really in that we go from 11th century Jerusalem to 12th century Cairo, and then that's Saladin coming in and sort of, in a way, in a crude way, revenge. The revenge of the Islamic world. The Crusaders have piled in. Let's teach them a lesson, and they get sent packing under the great leadership of Saladin, who's a Kurd. Slightly irony that who's often referred to by Saddam Hussein, who treated the Kurds abominably, but and Saladin was a Kurd. That's who he was. Yeah. Should we nip into Cairo, Mustafa, next?
Yeah. Just one thing, is that the Dome of the Rock in the background, or is
I was just looking at that and thinking exactly the same thing. It must be, mustn't it?
Okay.
Well, I mean, like a late artist version, anyway. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And
onion dome shape.
And fires going off in the right, and just terrible scenes, really.
Yeah. And I think what's worth also pointing out is that the Crusaders also killed a lot of Christians of other denominations, or people who, obviously didn't agree with what they were doing. Or,
yes.
There was quite a lot of Christians and people of other backgrounds as well as Muslims who perished as part of their.
I'm just scanning my bookshelves here, unfortunately in vain, but a new book has come out on the Crusade, which is really interesting because it says, traditionally it's that black and white Muslims versus Christians narrative, and he said it's much more complicated and sophisticated than that. And he described one battle where you have one Muslim leader with a Christian ally facing off against another Muslim with another Christian ally. So you've got Muslims and Christians versus Muslims and Christians in two particular armies, and constantly shifting alliances as well. So it's interesting new approach to the Crusades, and challenging those conventional narratives as well. But I think it was more black and white at the time for some people, and I would say Saladin would be one of those. If we move to Cairo next, please. And here I think I have to say the same old thing. One of my absolute favorite cities on earth. And I think late 12th century, Saladin restoring honor to the Islamic world after the horrors of the First Crusade and following crusades. They lasted a little bit longer, but finally were ended in 1291. Architecturally, interesting again, because Saladin built one of the city's greatest monuments, the Citadel, which survives today. I'm sure lots of people here today know and love it, or been there. Survives today on the raised ground, giving this beautiful view over the medieval old city of Cairo. And I think in the book, I brought in a slightly unlikely figure of Samuel Johnson here, because he wrote those famous lines, "When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life." And I just made the sort of comparison saying, compared with Cairo, London seems almost insipid, and Cairo is life. I described it as vital and visceral, overwhelming, suffocating, intoxicating, squalid, august, monumentally inspiring, and profoundly depressing. So I had a bit of a break from the historical research there, and had a bit of travel writing. But what an absolutely brilliant city. Well, today, and certainly in this time as well. And Egyptians often tell you Dunya, the mother of civilization, and are rightly and understandably proud of both this city and Egypt itself as well, which goes back, with 7 millennia of history, long before the period we're discussing as well. I've got a couple more on Cairo. This is interesting because I've talked a little mention or two of the cosmopolitanism. So 12th century Cairo was an incredibly tolerant and cosmopolitan place. And I felt this became one of the book's enduring themes, that great cities are open to the world, to ideas, to trade, to migrants. And I think I would say that tolerance and openness were not incidental to the great political and economic success of Fatimid Cairo. They were its foundation. And they allowed the free flow of goods and ideas right across the empire and beyond. And sort of Exhibit A, you could say, around 1165, the great Jewish philosopher Maimonides came to take refuge in Cairo. And this is a draft of his legal code, the Mishneh Torah. And the next slide is related to this again, a really interesting source that historians have been kind of ferreting around in recent years. Gives you a glimpse into medieval Jewish Cairo. It's called the Geniza documents, named after a storeroom in a synagogue where just basically nothing had been thrown away. So you've got 1,000 years of history in the form of something like 250,000 documents. And they tend to be those small, apparently, people say these aren't from rulers, they're not political and constitutional records. No, I think they're much more interesting than that. They're highly personal. Marriage contracts, divorce deeds, shopping lists even, commercial contracts, shipping information. It's like all the world is here really, with fantastic detail. So these have enabled historians to, shine light on what, for example, what was the Jewish experience under Fatimid Egypt like. So that's an interesting new area of research.
You mentioned Maimonides came to Fatimid Egypt because he was suffering persecution. Was that after the Reconquista in Spain? Was that prior to that? Was it some other series of events that made
I think I forget the exact details, Mustafa, but thanks for asking this. He was certainly being persecuted. It's a little bit before, because it's around 1165, so it's something like a century before that. And I forget where he'd come from. I should say, with a ruthless commercial hat on, the answers will be in the book. because it's 6-7 years ago. I can't quite remember where he was on the run from. But it was just, it interested me that, a medieval Jew should seek refuge in, Fatimid Cairo at the time. It's just a very strong sign of someone, voting with his feet. I'm going to go to Fez now, if I may, please. And unfortunately, yet again, I'm going to repeat myself and say one of my favorite cities on earth again. The last time I went, I took my wife, and she had never been. And it was the time when there's, Google Maps was still there. So I said, oh, well, we were invited to dinner somewhere. I said, well, let's try and find our way on Google Maps. And I think for the first time, you could almost see the steam coming out of the iPhone. It said the words "unable to find a route," and I just thought, absolutely, how brilliant is that? The sort of medieval Fez had outsmarted the Californian tech bros with these intricate zenkas, alleys, little streets, which were designed to be like that to deter invaders who might, pile into the Medina. They would never find their way around because it was labyrinthine. So I chose this city, Fez, to be my kind of model for the 13th century. So again, like some of the cities we've looked at already, at that time it was resplendent, it was incredibly self-confident, and vigorously cosmopolitan. It had the world's oldest university, dating back to the 9th century. And you have these beautiful madrasas, religious colleges of Fez, many of them built by the Marinid dynasty in the 13th and 14th centuries, which today are really the most stunning, glittering architectural showpiece of the city. Here in this particular picture, we can see the Bu Inania Madrasa through the arch of Bab Bujlud, which is one of the main entrances to this fabulous old city. The next one, I think, is off the Medina. You can't really tell, obviously, from these aerial views, but the complexities of navigating through the Medina can be quite mind-boggling, and I still love it that Google Maps couldn't plot a way from A to B. I mean,
we had a similar experience in Marrakesh. When you go into the Medina, you get there and you try and sort of start using the maps, and then afterwards you give up because there's no point, and you just use instinct and ask people, like in the old days.
And you make mistakes and you learn from them and you forget which way to go. And I love that. I almost felt that to discover the city, you have to kind of lose yourself in it properly, and not worry about, is it the left or right here, and just explore. Yeah, lovely. UNESCO World Heritage Site and the largest car-free city in the world. Within Fez, again, the next slide, I called this, within my 15 cities, I would say this was the smelliest place of the lot. In the heart of Fez, but the ancient tanneries. An interesting kind of historical continuity here, that the conditions the workers have toiled away in are remarkably similar, across about 1,000 years of history. Why is it smelly? Well, let me give you an idea of what the sort of the products are here. The tanners are navigating these wells, which are filled with cow urine, pigeon poo, quicklime, salt, and water, which are all used together to strip and soften the leather hides. And then these leather items are plunged into these sort of cisterns, I suppose you call them, or chambers, tanks, filled with dyes of fuchsia, magenta, burgundy, blue, yellow, whatever color the wily fazzy merchants think will sell well this season. It could be handbags, overnight bags, luggage, you name it. They will offer it to you, and it's a wonderful Medina and souk in Fez. I've always had quite an intense time. I don't know about you, Mustafa, but as a middle-aged bald man and as a skint student, I've had quite an intense time in Fez, where the guides and the sellers seem to have a more kind of intense energy about them, and kind of like occasionally tread with care.
Yeah, no, certainly intense. But I think I guess I probably was able to blend in a bit more in Morocco, so I could sort of maybe pass as a local sometimes. So that kind of helps a bit. But still, yeah, you know, they can sort of, they know who's a foreigner and who's not, and they'll try it. And yeah, no, it was certainly quite intense. But after a while, you kind of sort of know your way around, and you sort of almost know when to sort of put your shield up and when to sort of just, you know, have a bit of a laugh and then just move on. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I don't really mean intensity so much in a negative way. There's a bit of a thrill to it, really.
Yeah.
It's in a way maybe a little bit like Cairo, that kind of the intensity of life there. This kind of this throbbing, pulsating medieval city in the heart of Khan al-Khalili in Cairo, for example, and the Medina in Fez. I mean, for example, the next city we come to, I found it utterly unlike that, and it may be almost more of a museum, which is Samarkand. So 14th century now, and I wrote a biography on Tamerlane almost 20 years ago now, I think. And I thought when I got to the 14th century, it's got to be Samarkand. Now, obviously, that's an ancient city and it goes back several thousand years. But in the 14th century, I would say you don't perhaps have an Islamic leader with this much power, but also that the 14th century is really the period in which he transforms much of his world and the world around him. And let's give him his name, Timur Lang, Timur the Lame, as he was known disparagingly, and often known, generally known better in the West as Tamerlane. I remember writing about him back in the day, and wherever you went in the Muslim world, everyone knew exactly who Timur was, whereas in the West, even the most educated people would look a bit mystified and say something like, oh, didn't Christopher Marlowe write a play about him or something? But we couldn't tell you what century he was from, who he was, what he did. City-wise, obviously, the connection here would be Samarkand. So was his great capital. And to summarize his military conquest, his military career rather, from 1370 to 1405, he hardly stopped campaigning, and he was never defeated in battle. And wherever he went, he sacked, pillaged, and destroyed some of the greatest cities in the world at the time, and from Beirut to Baghdad, Antioch to Aleppo, Damascus to Delhi. And in 1402, it was the only time, in Turkish history that the Sultan was captured in person. And in that time, Timur stood on the brink of conquest in Europe. If he'd wanted to, could have continued west, but ultimately he couldn't be bothered. It simply was just not, it was too small fry. The prizes on offer were just not worth it in his mind. So he turned home, headed east, and died en route to war with the Ming emperor in 1405. Now, he was called many things. The Sword Arm of Islam was one of his many nicknames or titles. Lord of the Fortunate Conjunction of Planets. In the West, well, in Marlow, he was the terror and scourge of the world. And the reason he was a terror is because when he defeated his enemies, the next slide shows you what he did to them. that tower at the back is obviously a stylized Persian miniature of severed heads. And you see the soldiers, well, right in the foreground, you have these soldiers who've had their heads cut off. Then right above them, you've got soldiers carrying heads and sitting down in that sort of blue robe with the red robe beneath it is Timur. And the soldiers are doing what they did in a number of his conquests, which were, every soldier was told to bring 1 or 2 heads to him, for example. They were then piled up in mounds and towers around the conquered cities, often covered in oil and then set alight. And so this is a 16th century rendition of those trademark battlefield signatures, really. And it's interesting because you have the rhetoric. Timur is generally using the rhetoric of jihad, but by far the majority of those killed by Timur would be fellow Muslims, as opposed to Jews, Christians, or people of other faiths. So I think Muslim leaders at the time, and quite possibly today, regard the Timurid era as a bit of an apocalypse, where you had so many Muslims slaughtered in the name of jihad, and many of the great cities of the world sacked as well, to the benefit of his own capital of Samarkand. But let's stay on Samarkand, but can we move to the next one, please? Because I thought what interested me about Timur is it's not just, unlike maybe Genghis Khan, for example, he's much more than a military conqueror, and huge time, effort, money, resources are funneled into Samarkand to make it one of the great cities on earth. So it's a golden age for the arts, and hence the word Timurid to describe the era, Timurid architecture. And you see that right across Central Asia, including, I would say, Iran as well, these blue tile, blue sheathed monuments, absolutely stunning, mosques, minarets, madrasas and palaces. And the British Foreign Secretary in the late 19th century, George Curzon, called this the noblest public square in the world. I think it's a pretty good description of the Registan of Samarkand, which is, Mustafa, I'm sure you know it, and what an amazing space it is, really. With these three monumental set pieces on the square in the heart of Samarkand.
One of the great squares of the world. People talk about the Tiananmen Square in Beijing and the main square in Isfahan, and I think Registan sort of ranks highly among those as well. It does rival them in terms of its grandeur. You've got the 3 madrasas on 3 sides, and the vista and the way you look at Registan changes depending on what time of day. It's got a sort of a Taj Mahal effect about it, depending on what the lighting conditions are. It's absolutely stunning.
It's really magnificent, isn't it? Yeah. And so that's these slightly post-date Timur, but this is sort of I think grandson Ulugh Beg is one of the monuments, the astronomer king. But so he had, so I just felt he was a more interesting than just being a military genius. He was a cultured man who wanted to stamp his mark architecturally on his world as well, which he succeeded in gloriously.
And that's the thing. Some people are very frustrated with the contradictions of Timur.
Yes.
On the one hand, he's this bloody military expansionist who was, he was merciless. But at the same time, he patronized the arts, architecture, and some of the most fabulous architecture can be seen, and it was able to flourish. And developments in science and arts happened sort of during his period as well. So it's that contradiction which is quite frustrating sometimes.
I agree. It's frustrating, and I think maybe for the historians especially, particularly compelling or fascinating, because you're just trying to understand the mind of this man who was living 600-700 years ago, and who contained, as you say, those terrible not pronounced contradictions, incredibly bloody. And there were all sorts of what would today be called war crimes and atrocities in his military career, but spectacularly successful, and then architecturally, groundbreaking, really. And these monuments today, which we adore today, go back to the Timurid period. And the next one actually is where he's buried. So if we flip to I think one of my favorite monuments in Samarkand is the next slide.
The Gur Amir.
The Gur Amir. just a really splendid. Nice to get a sort of an aerial take on that, which would be nice actually to have that on the Registan as well. But that quintessentially Timurid style, the ribbed blue dome, the majolica tiles, which really glint, they're iridescent in strong sunlight. So these sort of flashing beacons right across Samarkand and, well, actually much of Central Asia, with the blue being a reference to both to water and the heavens. So he died in 1405. He'd wrought havoc across the Middle East and much of Central Asia, and you could, I sort of imagine, you could almost hear the entire Islamic world, not to mention Europe, breathing this great sigh of relief on his death in 1405, undefeated in battle. And so he's buried in that monument at the foot of his spiritual mentor, a man called Sayyid Baraka. And if you go inside that monument, when I was there, at least anyway, there was a caretaker who then said, for a small fee, let me show you where he's really buried. And you get taken down into a crypt beneath the ground level, and there is his tombstone. And it's a really interesting glacial cold crypt. And what was particularly interesting to me was the genealogy which Timur had basically invented. So he made himself genealogically related to both Genghis Khan and the Prophet Muhammad through a fictitious connection to the Caliph Ali, which simply didn't exist. But it was a way of sort of saying, I'm not just some, a barbarian from Fergana, Uzbekistan. I am, of royal noble blood. So that's there to this day, and you can see it. So that was the resting place of the sword arm of Islam, conqueror of the world. Complete change now for our next city. I don't know how we're doing for time. Are we okay?
We're okay, yeah.
Constantinople, 1453. I doubt he was 21 in this picture, but he was painted by Bellini in 1480. So yes, about 25 plus years after his great conquest of Constantinople, 1453. So in a nutshell, and obviously I'm simplifying it, but you have Christian Constantinople becoming Muslim Istanbul with one of the great conquests. I was really interested in the story, not least because most of the Arab Muslim armies had spent the best part of 800 years launching repeated attacks, expeditions, sieges against Constantinople, and none had succeeded until this 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan came along, and he really had to face down mutiny of his soldiers and his generals, who were saying, this guy is impetuous, he's reckless, he's rash, he's going to get us all killed. It's not going to work. The walls are too strong, and he just wouldn't take no for an answer. And this chapter really in the book is all about his meticulous preparations, really strong evidence of his sort of strategic genius, really. Mehmet removed what the Muslim writers of their time had described as a bone in the throat of Allah. So that, almost all of Christian Byzantium had been conquered, but you just had this little island of Christian Constantinople in the middle of it all, and it had to go. And this was the man to do it. I'm trying to gallop a little bit through that because it's it's a big military expedition. But architecturally, a couple more slides on Hagia Sophia, which you mentioned earlier, Mustafa. Should be in the next slide, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that the military expedition that was involved in the conquest of Constantinople. You could write books on that in terms of
exactly
the strategy, the sort of the kind of forward-thinking nature, the innovation, how to sort of overcome kind of obstacles, the sort of energy that was involved. There's a lot that went into it. I mean, military
yes.
is kind of they spend a long time sort of going through it because they learn so much from it.
Really thrilling, and his age, how impressive the age, and building. He built a castle called the Throat Slitter for several years before, in preparation for this thing. He just didn't let anything go to chance, and it was that sort of comprehensive, maybe eye for the detail, meticulous attention and care, which resulted in the success. So yeah, again, I have to say one of my favorite cities in the world. Maybe a number of us here today absolutely love it. The next one as well, please, on Istanbul. The great skyline. We were talking a little bit earlier again about before the session began on architecture, and I was asking about Sinan, Suleiman the Magnificent's Ottoman architect, and you could write books about him and the architectural stamp he left on much of the Islamic world. And this is just a really that great aerial view of one of my favorite cities. Quite interesting as well. I would say one obvious change in more recent times. I would say well, less cosmopolitan in the absence of the Greeks, who were there until the, I don't know, 50s and 60s perhaps. You'll struggle to find that old Greek community there. I think the Greek Orthodox community in 1927 was 100,000, and today, this is already several years old, there were something like 3,500 ethnic Greek residents. But I would say, you probably could say that it's become cosmopolitan in different respects, and there are an awful lot of Syrians now call Istanbul their home as well, with the after the turbulence of events in Syria for the last decade. Another hop next is, I think, a slightly unusual one, but I like it, and one of the most interesting men of his time, easily, unquestionably, Babur. Just when you thought you'd seen the back of Timur, Tamerlane, along comes his great-great-great-grandson, Babur the Tiger. And an absolutely fascinating character. And we have his diaries, which is, I think they've been described as one of the great, the most completely revealed individual of the 16th century. Because you have these first-person diaries, which read just so freshly all these centuries later. He was a hashish smoker, a wine drinker, a poet, a memoirist, and most important of all, a founder of the Mughal Empire. This picture reflects his great interest in horticulture, which also gave him his nickname, the Gardener King. So anyone who hasn't come across his memoirs, do have a look if you're inclined, or if you think he's remotely interesting. Have a look at the Baburnama, which I think is one of the greatest memoirs ever written. And there's just some lovely sort of modern touches he has. I remember there's one extract from a letter to his son, 1528, and it appealed to me as a journalist who occasionally write for publications like The Spectator, and it could come from a modern newspaper style guide. And this is Babur to his son. In future, write without elaboration. Use plain, clear words. It will be less trouble for you and the reader. This is sort of like literary tips in 1528. Next slide again, please, should still be with Kabul. Babur's Gardens. Relatively recently, my first trip to Kabul was 1996 in early Taliban period. And this was a complete wasteland. You wouldn't have been able to see any of those garden terraces at all. In subsequent years, thankfully, they've been restored by the Aga Khan Foundation. And this is now Babur's Gardens, one of the great monuments and public spaces in Kabul, which is just a wonderful city. And he's buried in these gardens, which is a very sort of evocative position within the city. Let's skip through the rest of Kabul because it's more, that's the tomb covered in bullet marks when I first visited. But a lovely spot overlooking this very beautiful city, which has obviously seen better times. And then the next slide as well, please. When I was working in Baghdad, I had to travel a lot by helicopter, which was a terrible sign of the dangers of this really terribly, well, spectacularly ill-judged Western intervention. And the next slide again, please. I was traveling around on these. I didn't realize at the time, but they date back to the 1970s. RAF Pumas, perhaps not the safest way to travel around Kabul these days. I'm just conscious, Mustafa, are we running out of time, or are we still okay?
About 15 minutes, so we'd like to open up the floor for questions in about 10-15 minutes. So yeah, so if we can sort of
okay. So I'll Isfahan next, please, and that will take us into the 16th century.
Justin, we have plenty of time. Take your time.
Thank you very much, Kaisera. This gentleman, ruler of the Safavid dynasty from 1588 to 1629, and I put him in him because of the city, which he embellished so magnificently to create one of the world's great cities, Isfahan. And it was an interesting period I found in the sources, really, when you've got the interaction between West and East, increasingly from this period to the advantage of the richer and technologically more advanced West. So it's come as late as that. So I would say throughout the book, it's not really until around here. Now, this is the 17th century, 1,000 years after the time of the Prophet. And for almost all of that time, I would say the Islamic world has been in the ascendancy. And around about this time, I mean, it's not an exact thing, obviously, there's not a single point you can say it happened then. But the interaction between West and East is starting to become more greatly to the West's advantage. Architecturally splendid again. It's one of the great themes of this period, or the story rather. As you can see in the next slide, an architectural detail from the Ali Kapur Palace of Isfahan, described by Robert Byron. He said, if the outside is lyrical, the inside is Augustan. And he compared its splendor to Versailles, the Doge's Palace, St. Peter's, the porcelain rooms at Schönbrunn, and he reckoned that each one fell short of that. Really a crowning masterpiece of Iranian art. As is the next monument. Next slide, please. The Masjid Shah, the Royal Mosque, crown jewel of Isfahan's colossal main square. There's a nice inscription on the foundation which said, a second Kaaba has been built. And it's just in those few words, a very sort of pithy expression of the Safavids' ambition to rule the Islamic world. Another Isfahan picture, next, please. Monumental, the great public square, Meydan-i-Naksh-e-Jahan, the image of the world square. And I think those few pictures, to me, went quite a long way to justifying the old Iranian proverb, which is, excuse my terrible pronunciation, Esfahan Nesfe Jahan. Isfahan is half the world. So you have this wonderful Islamic architecture, I think, justifying those sort of those claims to greatness. Now, in a way, I think the next city for me was perhaps the least historically justified, but I think I've always said this is a very personal list. My father took me to Tripoli when I was a teenager, and I sort of fell in love with it. He'd worked there. I ended up working there as well. He was in business, and I always approached it more as a writer and a journalist and historian, as opposed to from a business perspective.
And this is Tripoli in Beirut, in Lebanon, as opposed to Tripoli in Libya.
Sorry, this is Tripoli, Libya. You're absolutely right. Thank you for pointing that out. It's Tripoli, Libya. Yeah, and so not the most glorious city in the 18th century, which I use it for here, but a very interesting time historically, when you have sort of peak Barbary corsairing or / piracy, and that's interesting as well, because the conventional narrative would be that it was one-way traffic. Where I grew up, say in the UK, Muslim corsairs attacking white Christian ships, and the reality is much more interesting and complicated than that, which is I ended up describing it really as a bit of a free-for-all. Muslim, Christian, Jew. It's more faith blind than that, and you have, I would call them maybe European converts of convenience, so Scots, Icelandic, French, Belgium, German, whatever, relocating to North Africa and plying the Mediterranean as corsairs from Tripoli, from Algiers, from Tunis, and from Saleh in Morocco as well. And I get a little bit of 21st century reporting then. So next slide, please. One of Tripoli's youngest revolutionaries, maybe. This is taking us into 2011. And then the next slide, please. Well, I mean, Tripoli's old city, Medina, it's obviously much smaller than a number of those other cities we've dwelt on today, but still very evocative. I've always loved the Medina and Tripoli, a warren of whitewashed homes and souks. But let's go to the 19th century as time's running out. And I wanted to, this is maybe a little bit more personal for me as well, but my father was born in Beirut in 1938. And completely out of the blue during this project, I discovered I had a Lebanese Christian great-grandmother in the town of Jazin, 25 miles south of Beirut. And I always thought that needs to be on my list one day for, research trip maybe. But 19th century, I think Beirut, for me, justified its position in the book as one of the great cities of the Islamic world, mixed cosmopolitan city, growing fast, the Nahda, the sort of Renaissance, great time for trade, media publications proliferating, spectacular natural setting. And there, I used a quote from the late Lebanese historian Samir Kassir, and he described it as a peninsula that seems to have fallen to earth from the heavens. It's this sort of outrageously beautiful natural setting. Next slide, please. But I said, I think also one of the, and I think this is probably true today, one of Beirut's greatest strengths as well as weaknesses was its cosmopolitan multi-faith population. And this is a scene from the Civil War of 75 to 90, which I always saddened my father watching the city of his birth really destroying itself. And I think that I found maybe in Beirut more than some of the other cities I looked at, the darker side of Beirut's story, the kind of reverse face of the cosmopolitan mirror, is this sort of tangle of sectarianism and competing national identities. And then in the shadow of external powers certainly like Syria and I suppose one would say Iran today. I've got a long extract which I think is too long for now. So in the interest of time, I think I just had some case studies of 3 really interesting people who one by one were assassinated, and that was a historian, a politician, and an activist. And I think I entered the paragraph with a few words. Beirut is sun-kissed, sybaritic, and welcoming, but it is also dangerous, blood-stained, and cruel. A difficult place, but I mean, wonderful city. Yeah, so we're getting close to the end now. Dubai, next slide, please.
Just before we move into the Gulf, I was just reflecting on some of the places that you mentioned. So Isfahan, and then Tripoli in Libya, and then Beirut in Lebanon, and all of them have sort of been experiencing war in some form or another. I mean, I'm not sure if it's the Ali Kapu Palace, so one of those monuments was actually hit as part of the recent attacks by the US and Israel. I'm just not sure which place it was in Iran, but it just got me thinking about how these places have been going through quite a lot of ups and downs in the recent past.
Yes, I think you're right. And much of the region. I mean, I'm working on a new project now about the Hashemites, which I think is really, I call them maybe the world's oldest dynasty, going back to the pre-Islam, the cusp of the arrival of the Prophet Hashim ibn Abd Manaf in the 5th century, and the mosque in his name is in Gaza to this day, and there've been conflicting reports about the damage that have been done to it in the Israeli attacks. I've received sort of both positive and negative news about that particular monument, but fingers crossed it's still there. But as you say, the wider region, yeah, absolutely. With the possible exception of these last 2 cities, but even obviously in Dubai, I'm not sure about Doha, but the attacks of this recent conflict have not left them unscathed. Right. I remember ordering these last 2. For me, Dubai was a 20th century story. It doesn't mean that it's not interesting and active today, but it was the bulk of the transformation was a 20th century story, I felt. And I made a not entirely facetious comment, but if you in the 19th century, the surest sign that the British were about to invade, bombard, or simply appropriate your country came in the polite and earnest form of cartographers and surveyors. And when you see this map, this was compiled by the British in 1822. It makes you think, how quickly can a city grow? Dubai was literally a backwater there. As you see on the map, the close-up is on the right, the bigger map is on the left. It's literally a backwater on that, just south of that, the curve of the creek. a sheikh's house, a watchtower, a couple of gates, wells, and a couple of date plantations, and that was Dubai. Next slide is 1975. Still a pretty sleepy backwater. And Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum called the creek the very heart and soul of Dubai. It's raison d'etre. And it's not a fanciful or florid line. It's absolutely right. And that's why the Maktoums really bet the farm, in the words of one of my interviewees. They bet the farm on dredging the creek, borrowing huge amounts of money to finance it, to keep the dredging of the creek, to keep the waterway open and attractive and navigable to commercial shipping. Next slide, please. Really, the next picture is, for me, an amazing sort of representation of build it and they will come. That was the Al Maktoum's family approach to development. Constantly being poo-pooed by British advisors, by other Arab neighbors who thought, who the hell are you and Dubai? And what are you talking about making it a tourism capital? And, you know, you're kidding yourself. But the approach was build it and they will come. That was the approach to development. Under Sheikh Rashid, huge container ports were built, the airport, aluminium smelter, a natural gas plant, and so on and so forth. And I also found it interesting, having spent lots of time in Baghdad, and lots of Arabs would always slightly roll their eyes to me when talking about Dubai, saying, oh, they've got no history, it's nothing. I would say that still much of the Arab world comes to Dubai in their droves. It is one of the most cosmopolitan. And I at the time I said peaceful places in the Muslim world. Maybe that's changed a little bit recently with the current conflict, but people vote with their feet from all over the world to go and live in Dubai. Last one, Mustafa, will be Doha. And I remember actually at the time there were slight sensitivities in the region with Emiratis and Qataris about why I put Doha last and not Dubai. And I was just saying, look, it's not a political decision. It's the great story of Doha to me is a 21st century story, and the most interesting period for me on Dubai was the 20th century, and it was literally no more than that. Doha came to the party much later. Really interesting in terms of a story of urban development. They had, what are they called? Star architects. Yes, star architects. I.M. Pei, Zaha Hadid, Jean Nouvel. And for me, I felt it was like the ultimate rags to riches in decades story. So quick, the development. This is I.M. Pei's Museum of Islamic Art in the heart of Doha, one of the most sort of arresting and ebullient landmarks in this city, money being no object. And I also wrote about, both in the context of Doha and Dubai, what lots of Qataris and Emiratis talked to me about, either on or off the record, the question of identity and what it feels like to be sort of a minority population in your own city or in your own capital, in your own country, which was just an interesting thing to reflect on. And I just really ended on the last slide, Doha again. I think, at the risk of being slightly mischievous, but this was what it's known locally as the condom. But the ruling family don't particularly like the nickname of that building. But it's such an extraordinary city by night, and these probably are already quite old pictures. It was just what interested me was the breakneck speed of urban development, and I think, Mustafa, in the interest of questions and shutting up for a moment, I'll end there, if I may. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, please don't feel like you have to rush. I mean, the forum is open now, so we're just going to be sort of taking questions, commenting on some of the comments that others have made during our discussion, and sort of elaborating on anything else that we might want to steer the discussion towards. So, but thank you very much for this historical overview. And I say it's an overview because you've kind of spanned the length and breadth of Islamic history in sort of just over an hour, which is incredible. And there's so many other places that you probably would have wanted to have included, and you haven't. You haven't been to Southeast Asia, to Sub-Saharan Africa. There's the more of the Indian subcontinent. That there's
absolutely
Balkans. There's so many other places. One thing that you mentioned was Sinan, and I was quite impressed by how far his footprint or his architectural footprint extended. It wasn't just limited to Istanbul. I mean, there's so many other places across that region where there's monuments that were built by him. I think the old Bridge of Mostar, if I'm not mistaken, was
Yes,
also
yes.
built by him, or he had some involvement in that.
And you have, yeah, you I guess you have that kind of interesting combination of kind of imperial power with the Ottomans and this architectural genius. And because he's working at the highest levels of the empire, his monuments, his architectural style can then be, you know, exported, replicated, imitated right across the empire. And he really, you know, in terms of a single architect who stamped a certain style and look, from the design of domes to the style of minarets, is really extraordinary. It's always appealed to me as something to write about, but it's maybe a little bit niche, but I think it's absolutely fascinating architectural legacy, as you say, way beyond Istanbul, while some of the gems are obviously in the heart of Istanbul as well.
Excellent. So the floor is open to questions and answers. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, you're more than welcome to do so. You can put it in the chat, or I think you're able to speak as well. I don't know if you have the functionality to do that, but you can certainly type it in the chat. There's someone by the name of Morag Cross who was commenting on the picture of Mecca that we showed at the beginning. And she's saying that the small figures in the foreground are known as staffage or staffage. And there's some of the most interesting parts of any topographical drawing, because you can see what the common people were wearing and sort of what the customs were. And it's something that the artist is sort of able to kind of convey to us through these images. So staffage, I've never come across that phrase, but
I've never come across that. It's a lovely thing to know and learn. Thank you, Morag.
And what else have we got? Someone's asked, could you tell us who wrote the new book? You know, we were talking about the Crusades, and obviously the story is a lot more nuanced in terms of, you know, the victims of the Crusades and some of the other battles that happened where there were maybe Muslims on both sides of the conflict. I mean, do you have the name of the book that you're referring to?
I'm going to find it any moment. Yeah, I'm just looking for it now because it's on my computer. Here we are. The title is The Crusader Storm, A Global History of the Wars for the Middle East, and the name of the writer is Nicholas Morton. That's Morton. It's just out this summer, and it really is good. It's quite a demanding read. It's written by an academic, but he's unusual in that an academic who really writes, you know, sort of galloping, compelling prose. There's a load of detail, and sometimes it is confusing with the names and the on again, off again alliances. But I think it's just a great job of portraying the complexities of the Crusades as well at various points. So yeah, I'd highly recommend that book, and just out this summer.
Fantastic. Interesting point that someone mentioned is that a lot of the developments that we see in the Gulf, in Doha and Dubai were, you know, arguably relied, the breakneck speed with which these were achieved arguably relied on migrant workers from, you know, places like Bangladesh, sub-Saharan Africa, India, and there's obviously other, you know, issues in regards to how they were treated as part of that process. I think that's something that I guess should be acknowledged as part of this. Not too dissimilar to the way maybe, you know, Timur was using laborers at the time, and some of the abuses that may well have happened then and will have happened more recently. So it's just, yeah, some things I guess never change when you've got multiple projects to achieve.
And actually, I'd say, well, I'm not sure, but yeah, in definitely in my writings about Tamerlane, I've talked about his use of well, both slave labor and he was always again, part of the sort of contradictions of the man. He was generally at pains to spare scholars, artisans, craftsmen, artists, musicians, and they would all be sort of like rounded up and then taken back to Samarkand. So they had some of those people would have had a fairly gilded kind of captivity, not allowed to leave, but would have been celebrated as, you know, fine craftsmen or scholars of their age. But equally, there would have been the use of, you know, forced labor. And in the chapters on Dubai and Doha, I also raised that the question of, you know, behind every sort of gleaming skyscraper, there are all number of men and women, as you say, often from the subcontinent, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and others, who are building these amazing monuments, and some would say that could be, or in some instances, it's a form of modern slavery.
Yeah.
And workers' conditions being pretty bad in some cases. Equally, I remember raising that in Dubai, and someone said, "This is all just Dubai bashing. You know, the West doesn't want us to develop, and they accuse us of A, B, and C. We're developing like everyone else." So, yeah, it's kind of contested territory. But I think, you know, human rights organizations would say that the situation often leaves a lot to be desired in some of those places, and they would say in return that the conditions have improved massively over the years.
And then the families of the people who actually work there, they'll say, well, this is actually our only source of income. If my, you know, family member wasn't working in Dubai or Doha or on these construction projects, then we wouldn't be able to, you know, sustain the family. So there's that dimension as well. So so yeah, it's certainly not straightforward, but I guess, yeah,
Yes.
it's important to have the discussion. And I think that those conversations are happening now, whereas maybe 10, 15 years ago they weren't. So
yes.
So the Babur Nama that you mentioned earlier on, so presumably would have been written in Persian, or in this.
Was it in Persian or Chagai Turkish? I think I should know this. Sorry, I've looked at it obviously in translation, and there are different editions. I forget which is the. I mean, if it's Baburnama, and there are different editions, but I'm not even also sure that they tend to mostly. I think they tend to be abridged. I can't remember how many decades he wrote his diary for, but it's just such an extraordinary document. And he describes, you know, what, you know, should he drink wine? Shouldn't he? He'd been thinking about it, agonizing about it, then tries it at last, doesn't like it. Then he talks about the difficulties of mixing a wine party with hashish smokers and the chaos that ensues, and he hates it, and he's got to do about it. And it's also the sort of first person angst of a man who is seeking to build a kingdom and an empire. It's just a brilliant read. It's such an unusual book, the Baburnama.
Yeah, no,
I think Dalrymple wrote a preface to one, a relatively modern edition, which is worth a look at as well.
So presumably the whole collection is translated into English now, or?
I think so. Whether it is the entire book, I'm not so sure. In my mind, I'm thinking that it might be an abridged version in English, but I may be wrong. And there have been a number of editions over the years. But for anyone who hasn't yet discovered the Baburnama, I think you're in for a fantastic treat. Such an unusual book. How modern! It just mind-boggling how modern it feels. 500 years later.
Yeah, no, the first thing, as soon as you mentioned it, it felt like one of those blogs that you see by an influencer, or you know, they sort of what they're doing. It's very, very modern, very sort of very social media kind of friendly.
Yes, absolutely. Which is bizarre in 1520s.
Yeah.
I have a quick question, if I may.
Yes, please.
I was just wondering, Justin, this was such an amazing presentation, absolutely fascinating. There's so much information there. How long, and I mean like how many years did it take you throughout your life to gather all that information? Because we just, you know, we're spending 1.5 hours watching it all, but how long did it really take, you know, to gather?
Well, thank you very much for your kind words. This one is slightly harder to answer that question because, for example, most of my books, I would say, typically takes me about 4 years to write them. But in this particular case, I was going back, for example, in the Cairo chapter, which is mostly historical, but then I've got a little bit of the first person stuff. And I reflect on my first experience going to Cairo, aged 18, trying to learn Arabic, learning backgammon, smoking shisha, just coming to terms with this wonderful city as an 18-year-old. So that's, you know, an example of where it goes back many years. And Tripoli, something similar. Fez a little bit, Kabul. So I should say the only ones I have of the 15 cities, the ones I have not visited are Mecca and Isfahan, so the others are all based on historical research, but also a first-person experience as well. So, sorry, that's a very long-winded answer, but the book took about 4 years to write, but it's based on a lot of, personal background.
And are you going to go to those two?
I'd have to convert to Islam or Mecca, so hold that thought. And Isfahan, I would say Isfahan is out of bounds for now, with the British passport for good reasons. But I would love to one day, yeah, definitely. I mean, everyone I know who knows Iran, both Iranians and non-Iranians, fill me with excitement about the possibility of traveling there, yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
I think once it settles, Isfahan shouldn't be too difficult to go to, because we had a group from the US who were there about a year ago, and as long as you fill up all the paperwork and the information is consistent, you're usually given a visa for 30 days or for however long is permissible. So
is that in recent years, Mustafa, as well? I mean, like how recent?
We're talking about 2025, yeah. So last year.
Okay.
Yeah. So because we do trips there as part of our company. So we have a couple to Iran, and there just so happened to be a group from the US who wanted to go around May 2025, and they managed
when do you think you might? Is it too early to say when you might go back?
Well, I mean, I guess we're ready, but it just depends on the situation on the ground and when it's deemed safe. And clearly at the moment it's still quite a difficult period. But I reckon sometime this time next year, if things continue as they are, it should be okay to get back to Iran.
Well, how fortunate that we've got a travel agent as the host.
Yes, I'm going to have to be back in touch, Mustafa, hoping to book something in 2027. Then.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. You're more than welcome. Yeah.
I think we've got another question in the chat.
I'll let you read that, Katarzyna. Yeah.
Okay, you talked about the oldest university in, sorry, can't remember the city, but you've heard about the university in Harran, Turkey. I think that was the oldest.
Yeah, so I think you were talking about the Qarawiyyin in Fez.
The Qarawiyyin.
Yeah, so this one is, is there something older in Harran in Turkey? Are you aware of something like that? Or?
Personally, I'm not, but I think when you get claims this is the oldest something in the world, they're often kind of rival claimants. But the Qarawiyyin, as far as I know, would generally, I think, be accepted as the oldest university in the world. But I wasn't aware of one in Turkey, but I didn't get the name from that.
The name of the university is not mentioned there.
No,
the
it's
city is
not
Harran
mentioned.
in Turkey. So
oh, okay.
Yeah, it'd be worth looking into that one. But yeah, the Qarawiyyin
which goes back to I think it was the 9th century, a widow in 9th century Fez. So yeah, pretty ancient, and still going strong.
Right, so I think we're coming up to the end of our scheduled time. If there are no further comments or questions, I think we'd be in a good place to wrap up. Did you want to add any more comments, Justin? Anything you wanted to sort of highlight? Anything that comes to mind that you probably weren't able to say before and you'd like to say so now?
No, I really just want to say thank you to you, Mustafa, for hosting us today, and Kaysra, Katarzyna, who I hope I'm not mangling.
No, it's perfect.
Thank you very much for putting this event today. Real pleasure to join you all. Thank you.
Justin,
thank you so much.
Katarzyna, I just want to say that was an incredible session. I'm sure all the attendees, and they've been coming and going, they absolutely loved it. One of the highlights of our festival year. Thank you for an amazing, incredible session taking us right across the world into the Muslim world. And thank you, Mustafa, for amazing hosting as well. And of course, Katarzyna. So back to you, Katarzyna.
Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Justin, Mustafa, fantastic hosting as always. Also, thanks to Hadra, who's supporting us in the background, showing the presentation. And as you can see, there is a slide, Muslim Diaspora Archives. That's the next event. It's an event aligned with the new initiative on MACFEST. Really another fascinating initiative because it will show you the memories and the histories of the first Muslim migrants in the UK. So that event is going to be on Tuesday at 6:30 UK time. You can register on Eventbrite as always. Then we've got creative recycling with Ala, who's our team member. Immensely creative individual. Honestly, you've got to see this event. It's on Thursday at 6 o'clock in the evening. And then on Saturday at 2 o'clock UK time, we've got food and fashion, fairs, which has been mentioned today, a model city of sustainability. And before we go, I just want to repeat that the Muslim Arts Awards submission process, which is free, is still open until the 25th of June. So if there are still any Muslim artists based in the UK who haven't submitted their works or would like to submit another work, please do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Bye.
Bye, Mustafa. Bye, everyone. Thank you.